All right, so hi everybody. Welcome to the 8th episode of The Mix. For the next hour, I will be your host, tour guide, provocateur, and interviewer. My name is Kevin Ascher. At Mixpo, I run our reseller sales team. I am very excited today to have as our featured guest, Jamey Power. Jamey Power is known mostly for his work at Jamey Power and Associates, but he started his career after college working at Foot Cone and Belding, FCB, so he knows our world of advertising. Moved on to a field marketing role at General Motors, and since 1990 joined the family business, where he remained until 2009.
Right.
Most recently as EVP of International Operations. So he is also the author of Satisfaction, How Every Great Company Listens to the Voice of the Customer. Best-selling author, now available on Amazon and at your local Barnes & Noble. Ladies and gentlemen, Jamey Power.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Oh, and last part I'll say, and so since 2009, Jamey is now currently a board member, investor, philanthropist, and also alpaca farmer.
But not retired.
But not retired. All right, so with that, we'll kick things off. So generally what we do in these series, we're honored to have guests such as Jamey, basically folks who have accomplished things in business, in community service, activists, things of that nature, because the whole spirit here is for wherever we are in our career, to be able to learn from folks who have paved the way and open our minds to some other things that aren't necessarily going into the office every day. So I've got a bunch of questions prepared, and at the end we will have some Q&A as well.
Good.
All right, so to kick things off, Jamey, tell us a little bit about, so Jamey Power and Associates, a name synonymous with customer satisfaction. Most of us fly Alaska Airlines. The words are on the door every time we walk in. Tell us a little bit about how did that get started? Like, what does it mean to be measuring satisfaction, and just how does that work?
Well, I think, first of all, before you can tell the story about where Jamey Power and Associates started and how it started, I think it's important to understand the background. So my father was going way back. His first job out of Wharton School of Business in the late 50s was to go work for Ford Motor Company. And he was from central Massachusetts. He didn't really know that he wanted to get into the auto industry. Had this vague idea from some classes he took at Wharton about something called market research, which was really kind of a new area, social science combining with business. And so back in the late 50s, if Wharton really wasn't even as well known as it is today as a business school, but companies were coming to campus, and much like today, going to work for Google or Facebook and recruiting on campus, the auto companies were the place to go. And so he was really blessed with that opportunity to go to Detroit and work for Ford. And I can tell some stories about that experience, but overall what he learned when he moved to Detroit is how clients like to torture the data until it confessed. Middle management just had this preoccupation of trying to make sure that the information looked good so that the bosses up above would think better of them. And he saw that this was really blinding to performance and understanding what was going on. That and a few other things, he decided to move west and get out of the auto business, and he wanted to practice the craft of market research, understanding what consumer behavior was, how it was impacting image and brand choices and purchase decisions and those things. And so he came out to Los Angeles. There was no car companies. He was working for a market research firm that was part of Interpublic Group, part of McCann Erickson. at the time, and he was just doing a wide variety of type of products. And he and my mother had a conversation. He was 37 years old. There were 3 kids in the family at the time, and with her encouragement, they decided to start Jamey Power and Associates, literally at the kitchen table in a small tract home outside Los Angeles. Pretty gutsy sort of move. No clients. You just have an idea and you want to go do something. So one lesson is you can do that at 37 years old and with 3 kids, and not, you don't hear about that much anymore. But anyhow, kind of naivete and foolhardy, they did it, and out there hustling. And when you're selling market research, you're much like I seem to understand your business. You're really selling ideas and techniques. You're not selling a product per se. And so he was able to leverage his experience in Detroit working for the auto industry into not his first client, but his first major client was this small company that was trying to re-enter the U.S. market after 10 years of failure, had a funny Japanese name called Toyota. And he really got into Toyota through a cold call and really being persistent of trying to get into the right person to get the business. And so that became a big client and really helped pay the mortgage and kind of put food on the table for the first couple of years. And then, as so often happens, you hear stories about a business so dominated by one particular client, you start to feel like it's 110% of your time, and you don't have time to do anything else. And then what happens if that client kind of decides to drop you and you haven't then developed other lines of business or clients? And so he was pushing to find other avenues for revenue, certainly working with other clients. But along the way, he had also developed this idea of, as you know, in the ad agency world, you can only work for one client per category. And you're not allowed to work for more than one. In market research was the same way. You could only work for Toyota. You couldn't work for Nissan or Datsun, or you couldn't work for Honda, or much less Chrysler or GM. You could only work in that one category. But he said that doesn't make sense. I've got some ideas. I've got a way of approaching the business that why don't we develop some market research studies that cover the entire industry, and called syndicated research, and why don't I go out and survey customers of several different cars. The company, Jamey Power and Associates, owns that information, and then we can sell subscriptions of that information out to multiple clients. So instantly, you might be able to, say, sell 10 subscriptions, and instead of dealing with one client, you've got 10 clients, but you're selling the same information, so you've got scalability. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what started to help put Jamey Power and Associates on the map, is doing those surveys on an independent basis, taking the risk of trying to do a survey of a particular group or new product, and then selling that information back to the industry. And so that's kind of one of the things that sort of helped separate Jamey Power and Associates from being so dependent on one client, and then established us as truly an independent voice, to the point where Jamey Power and Associates worked for and continues to work for all the different car companies, and develop an expertise in understanding sort of general consumer not just consumer awareness, but consumer behavior and consumer attitudes. And let me just, back to your original question, customer satisfaction really kind of just came along the way. It wasn't originally part of a business plan. It wasn't really an idea. It was almost a concept that we fell into.
Excellent. So the company started selling basically a quantitative product to a new company without having any data or anything right at the beginning, mm-hmm. which sounds like a challenge that we run into at times, because clients are always asking for more data, more of this, more of that. A lot of times things start conceptually before having the data even to back it up.
Well, I think one of the great things that we found and continued to find over the years is the best new products, the best new ideas came from client discussions. It came from a conversation with a client who's having a particular issue or problem with a particular area. And they said, we're trying to figure this out. Can you help us figure that out? And then that led to, and so as an example, quality. Now, looking at the room, you guys are all so extremely young. You take quality, especially in the automotive industry, probably for granted. In the 1970s, that was not the case. I mean, you had cars falling apart. You had dealerships giving not just poor service, but the technicians at the dealership didn't even know how to fix some of the product. And what Jamey Power, what my father and a few others at the time saw is an opportunity to measure on an independent basis the type of quality that car owners had in the first 90 days of ownership. That very important honeymoon period when you first get your car, and if something's happening, if something goes wrong, if the engine's making a funny sound, or the air conditioning's not working, or the gears are grinding, those are very important items. And so out of a conversation with several clients, he saw, well, gee, this is an important way. Toyota's measuring quality their way, and GM's measuring quality their way, and Chrysler's measuring their quality their way, and nobody was kind of like on the same currency, if you will. And so what Jamey Power & Associates did is create that common currency for all the industry to mark itself by. And then we got further embedded into the organizations, not just the market research department, but the quality department and the assembly plants and the engineering department, because then they knew what their J.D. Power number was for a particular vehicle or for an assembly plant. And so we became the currency by which they all then were measured and sometimes even incentivized against. And so the point is, it came out of a conversation with a client. It came out, and there are other stories like that.
So really the subtitle can now be satisfaction. We just kind of backed into it after a bunch of conversations with our clients.
No, it's
excellent.
It's true. But the essence of satisfaction in the consumer market is listening to the voice of the customer, and listening to the voice of the customer is really market research. And we always focused on the end customer. So often the auto industry or the other industries we serve, they get kind of hung up on who their customer is. For an automobile company, to pick on them, sometimes they think that the dealer is their customer, and they are to a certain extent. But it's really the end customer. It's you in the room who are the true customer, and they kind of forgot that the end customer really mattered, and what you felt about your vehicle was really important. And so again, to kind of lift off the idea of what customers wanted, our J.D. Power clients wanted, and leading to new products, then we started measuring the performance of the salespeople and how they treated you when you were negotiating and dealing with your vehicle. We talked about the finance companies who do the finance transaction, the leasing or the payment terms and things like that. So there are a whole broad range of things that just kind of rippled out. And then we started to get inquiries from places like Continental Airlines, who said, we need to change how we're doing business. Continental Airlines was one of the worst in the industry, and the CEO at the time, Gordon Bethune, said, we need to give something for our employees and everybody to measure against. And so he jumped on and said, J.D. Power & Associates, you're doing this for the auto industry, can you help us with the airline industry? And so we started to do measurement of customer satisfaction. Again, looking at it from a consumer's perspective, not a pilot's perspective or not a baggage person's perspective, but all the different attributes that you experience as airline passenger.
Interesting. So a lot of what you said strikes as really relevant for where we are, as I was saying earlier, Jamey. So we've just brought two companies together. We have complementary product lines, but I'd say as we start to figure out what our clients care about, what we think right now they care about in this combined entity may very well not be where we end up. So being open to that, listening. How did you know when someone asks you something, how do you measure against when to listen to it because it's still part of your mission and enhances and is the right thing to do as a company, or boy, this can take us off task and off mission and just distract us if we respond to every request from every conversation?
Quite honestly, it's more of an art. There's no science. Well, I shouldn't say there's no science, but it's more of an art. It's trying to talk things through, and ultimately somebody in the organization needs to make a call if you've got kind of competing sort of ideas or concepts. But I think remaining focused is really important. But if you don't branch out, if you don't look beyond, if you don't look over the horizon a little bit, you're going to be doomed to irrelevancy. So you have to make those conscious decisions to kind of stretch beyond, but it's an art.
So the acquisition of ShopIgniter was for us a very deliberate. We identified where we're strong, where we're weak. Oh, there's a company we should talk about partnering with. One thing led to another, and that was a very proactive decision. One of the things that also came to our business recently is clients started asking us, hey, we love using you for video ads, but we also have a lot of ads that don't involve video. Can you help us with that? And so we went through the whole process of, do we do it? Do we not? How do we do it? We decided to do it. We started to do it quite well. And so now it's an increasingly important part of our business. So one of the things that I found was really interesting in your book, and one of the concepts, is the connection between satisfaction, loyalty, business growth, because they're not necessarily synonymous. They lead to each other.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit? A satisfied customer may or may not be a loyal customer, and a loyal customer may or may not necessarily be satisfied.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple different dimensions or ways you can answer that question. Number one, I've mostly studied it more from a consumer market perspective. So consumer loyalty versus a B2B type situation is different. But I also know that you serve companies that are ultimately selling to consumers. So I think answering it in that way. I think loyalty is really important, and there are measures. Some people think that that's the ultimate way of measuring how satisfied your customers are. But in our work, in our studies, and as we've thought things through, it's not just loyalty. And if you're only focusing on loyalty, you're missing a whole bunch. Today, in almost any category, you have more choices than you know what to do with. And because there are more choices, just the odds are against you, because consumers just want to try something new. And so just kind of holding on to them, getting that loyalty, is just becoming harder and harder. Now, I'm not saying you don't focus on loyalty, but if that's your sole focus, if you put more of your, say, budget or time against consumer loyalty, you're missing the bigger boat. I think what's more important is thinking about customer satisfaction as part of your brand. And what I mean by that is the experiences that these customers have with that brand. If they're good customer experiences, they're going to tell more people. The word of mouth is exponentially greater, and it adds more business potential for conquest. It'll help the loyalty as well. But if you focus on it more from that perspective, I think you're getting more mileage out of the experience.
So that's a great segue, because one of the things that as Mixpo we look at where we're strong and competitive advantage, We've always come back to service as one element that seems to come up. Our clients tell us they like doing business with us. But when we meet someone who we didn't get referred to or we're relatively coming in cold, we tell them we have great service, we start to sound a lot like every one of our competitors or every technology company that had come in the door before us. Any advice or tips of when you want to tell someone you have great service before they've had a chance to experience it, is there any way you can make it stick and make it resonate more when they haven't yet experienced it? Or
Well, I think if you were dealing with a broad enough client mix where you could do surveys all the time and do it, with a reliable statistical means, I think doing a survey would be great because you'd be able to kind of point to the numbers. And especially if that survey was happening on an independent basis and you can line up how does Mixpo do versus its competitors. But it doesn't sound like you're really in that type of business.
And how big's the J.D. Power category of rich media ad tech companies? Because one of those trophies would look really good.
You know that I don't work there anymore. So. But I could be a coach.
Be good.
So, I think that short of that, trying to do it on a statistical, data-driven, I think storytelling is a compelling method. And what I advocate for, especially in a B2B situation, is collecting stories. If you create a storytelling culture, and there are people in your organization that are responsible for being the librarian of those stories and the enhancer of those stories, that becomes your compelling selling tool. Those stories, and if they're done in the right way, and I'm not just kind of like babbling, talking about babble, I'm saying structured in, here's the situation, here's the problem, here's the dilemma. Think about it like a TV show. Here's the issue, here's the conflict, and then here's the solution.
Yep.
And I'm not saying fictionalize, and I'm not saying overly dramatize, but you can construct anything into a good story. And the more you build that story culture into your organization, then it probably already happens anyhow, but as you grow, if you're not deliberate about it, it becomes kind of lost, like
That's right.
caveman, prehistoric type stories. You lose that. And so if you are purposeful and disciplined about it, those stories become more compelling than throwing a data a graph on a client's desk saying, here's why you should hire us. Because those stories, as an example, I don't know if you guys remember, there's a General Motors line of vehicles called Saturn. And Saturn was going to outdo Toyota and Honda in everything that they did. And Saturn launched. The product was well, I can get into a lot of issues as why it didn't succeed in the end. But at the time, they launched, and the product really didn't end up kind of matching it head to head. It was supposed to be better than a Honda or better than Toyota, and it kind of ended up being about even, if not maybe a tick below. And so they launched, from a product standpoint, kind of in that parity situation. Their dealership organizations, however, were totally focused on the customer. No negotiating on price, very different profile of the salespeople. They weren't even called salespeople. The dealership was incentivized more based on customer satisfaction scores, totally different than the traditional car dealership. And what Saturn also knew is they needed to show that they weren't just any other GM product with bad reputation for parts and service and warranty. And so they had a system set up so that when they had a quality issue, they were going to swarm that issue. and they were going to go above and beyond. So they kind of had almost like a go team in place, like EMTs or something. And boom, within the first month, they had, I can think of two situations. One where seat mechanism, like the reclining seat, was defective, and another one that was, let's see, I'm trying to think, had something to do with the engine. Like they put the wrong motor oil in, and it really probably didn't make that much of a difference. But they turned a failure, a weakness, into a terrific moment. So what they did is they kind of like promised everybody, come into the dealership. We're going to change the oil, put the right oil in, or maybe it was antifreeze or something like that. And they gave the people another car to use while it was, and they really turned it into a positive instead of normally that in the industry it would be considered a negative. And so my point is that became a story.
Mm-hmm.
And that story then kind of took on legendary status. And so for years afterwards, they were telling that story about, as an example of how they take care of their customers. And that is an example of kind of a storytelling culture.
Interesting. We definitely have those tales of heroism, but I don't think we haven't institutionalized it as much as we could.
And you have to be purposeful about
Mm-hmm.
it. You can't just kind of expect to kind of walk down the hall. As you guys continue to grow, hopefully you're at the same rapid pace. If I came back, say, in a year, you might be double in people. How can you expect all those new people to kind of know those stories?
Yep. So let's use that as a segue to the next section. So some of your current work and activities. So we were just talking, and you mentioned that you sit on the board of Root Metric, a company based here in Bellevue.
Yes.
That's what brought you into town, and that they are in rapid growth phase.
Mm-hmm.
It's revenue, people, just everything that goes along with it. So we are in growth phase. We have been rapidly growing headcount, growing our product. Our revenue has been growing. What are some of the, and by the way, some of your predecessors on stage have been some of our board members, so we've heard from them, but you having no connection with the company, you see Root or other boards that you sit on, issues, challenges, opportunities when a company reaches that rapid growth stage. Like, what are you counseling them on? What are you seeing as both good and bad, and just things for us to keep in mind as we're at the onset of that process?
I think probably the biggest thing that I counsel on is having an entrepreneurial culture, but that doesn't mean free reign to just go and have everybody do what they want to do. It's having processes and procedures in place, and I'm not talking about Nazi-like procedures, but you just can't scale your growth unless you have good processes and procedures. So, as much as you are irritated by it, it's like brushing your teeth. You just got to do it, right? But
now he's the oldest sibling,
Yeah, I'm
so
the oldest
the
of four
focus
kids,
on
yeah.
discipline
Yeah.
and order and structure. I'm the youngest, so yep.
I was going to make a comment too about how you raise kids, but so I think that trying to keep that entrepreneurial spark is really important as well. And so having people always be looking out for the next new product or service line or opportunity is really important, and you don't want to squash that. I think having a great orientation program is not a insignificant investment. And I guess I shouldn't say it's not necessarily money, it's more having the thought of how do you bring people on board. The quicker you can get new people on board and acclimated, the quicker they can really be pitching in with all their effort. So having a great orientation program, I think, is really critical. When Jamey Power and Associates, during the almost 20 years I was there, we were growing like, sometimes 20%, and even when you're in multi-million dollar range, that's difficult. And I think the things we struggled with would be employees that just associates that just kind of came in from a different place, and they just didn't quite fit in, and having a good orientation program really is critical to making sure that improves the odds. I think the other thing is having a really effective way of evaluating employees, or excuse me, candidates for employment. Testing and fit, and maybe some of the, I don't know if you guys do psychological sort of testing, not to see if they're crazy, but
oh, we've hired some of those. Don't worry.
but it's important to kind of, depending on how the character of the existing organization is, if you kind of bring somebody in that's kind of like marching in a completely different direction, you've got to make a judgment as to whether that's going to help you from a diversity standpoint, or that's going to kind of create a problem. And that's where management kind of also has to, have a strong voice about, kind of balancing it between, you don't want everybody to be wearing white shirts and khaki slacks and, kind of being Stepford like employees.
JD Power itself was acquired, so you've been through the experience of being acquired.
Yes.
I don't know, actually, was JD Power ever on the acquiring side? Do you have tales of, advice learned from both sides?
We sold the company. We made the family decision in 2005 to sell the company. My father was in his 70s. My mother had passed away. I was the oldest of the 4 siblings. And I had one sister in the business. So I felt like we'd kind of gotten the business up to a certain level, and it didn't make sense for us as a family to continue to own the business. So we went through a process of trying to figure out what to do. Sell it to some of the management team, sell off a piece of it, things like that. So that was a whole experience. And no regrets on what we did. We ended up selling to McGraw-Hill, which at the time was textbooks, magazines, newspapers, a lot of different media and information properties, as well as Standard & Poor's and a lot of financial related stuff. And they've since kind of done away with that diversity strategy, and they're really focusing more on the financial side. When we acquired companies, I think that one of the huge things is just making sure that the parent company invests enough energy in trying to make sure that the acquired company is taken care of and fits in. And again, this is more art than it is science.
Right. Happy hour afterwards.
But and you do acquisitions for different reasons. When I was there, it was after I continued to work after McGraw-Hill took us over, and one of my jobs was in charge of international operations, and we started. I made my first trip to China in 2000 or before 1999, I think it was, and we're trying to do business in China, and we had that strategy, and we kind of got to a point where we needed to grow faster in China, and the best way to do that was by acquiring a company. And what I felt, so using that as an example, taking like one of my number 2 people working for me and sending him to Shanghai to help make sure that the acquired company, is properly taken care of and things are, so to speak, translated appropriately. So it takes a lot of effort, and I think that too often, I think in the business world, people sort of expect things to just happen. You kind of, you combine the employees and you kind of tell the IT people to work together and the HR people to work together, and then you just kind of go on your merry way. It doesn't work that way. You've got to really be conscientious about making sure that the teams work together. And sometimes, I think, trying to think about some other examples, it might mean also asking, say, somebody from the parent company to go, if there's a different physical location, to say move to that new location and then have somebody from the acquired company move into, say, headquarters and act as a kind of a little bit of a voice.
Interesting. So now one of your jobs is you sit as a board member on the Family Foundation. So as I was saying beforehand, a lot of folks in the audience either currently or still figuring out how they could get involved in nonprofit philanthropic type activities. So what can you tell about the priorities, just what's involved in translating from the business world into social causes?
Well, for me, I felt like I spent almost my whole career really just head down, focused on the business, especially being a family business. And it was, I think, I don't know, around 2000 or so when there was a local university. This is kind of, I'm telling my story about, my parents, we grew up and my mom was always a big volunteer in the public schools, and same with my father to a certain extent. And so I always saw them, but they didn't really talk about it. And my father was so busy, he didn't like coach sports teams or anything like that. And we went to church regularly and stuff and made donations. But we weren't like over the top or showy or anything like that. But we knew philanthropy and volunteering was also important. And I think it was around 1999 or so, there was a local private university in our little suburban city, and they were looking for members of the community to come, be on an advisory board or board of trustees. And they approached my father and my mother about my dad joining the board, and he says, "Oh, I'm too busy. I got too much going on." And somehow in this conversation between the president of the university and his wife and my mother and my father, I ended up being tagged to be like this new board member. And so
I'll give you my son. How's that?
So at a relatively young age of something like 36 or so, I was the youngest board member at this private university, local university. And it was like, oh God, I don't want to do that. I want to focus more on business and stuff like that. But it turned out to be like one of the best things for me personally, because it helped pull me out of the office. I was, between the family and I had 3 kids and a wife and the business. It just helped give me perspective. And so ever since then, and I developed new friendships and new ways of looking at things, and it just helped broaden my view of the world where I really wouldn't have known that otherwise. So now I'm a big advocate for, when you have time, making time to do work like that. And this was at a board level. I mean, you can make sandwiches for homeless and things like that too, but so I'm not suggesting that it has to be so formal. But it just really helped give me a broader sense. And then what I found, particularly in my interest, education has always been very interesting to me, and then trying to apply some of these lessons that I've learned in business to an academic institution, it's like, bringing water to the thirsty. It's like, oh God, I never thought about a strategic plan, or doing a survey to measure how the students rate the professors. It's like, oh my God, or asking alumni what they think about. So it's been rewarding from that standpoint. And so I've just I was on that board for 9 years, and term limits got me out, and then I ended up joining the board of the Alumni Association from my school, University of San Diego, and then that did well there, and then they asked me to be on the board of trustees there, and so I've just finished 3 years of being on that board, and then I'm on a couple different boards for the National MS Society, a local chapter board, and then also a board that's involved with fundraising for research for MS.
Okay. Well, as before we'll open up for questions in a second, but as a thank you for being here, Mixpo is excited. We'll be making a donation in your name to the charity of your choice. So I think I have a good idea of what where you'll want us to direct that.
Okay. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. So, yeah, no, if there are questions, I'd love to help answer.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Jeff. So it was mentioned very briefly, like having the alpaca farm. So how did you get into alpaca farming? What about it was interesting to you? And what's your biggest surprise, your biggest unknown?
Okay, so the story is,
welcome to Mixpo, by the way.
I met my wife at FCB, Fukona Belding, when she was in the art department and I was in account management. So ever since I've known her, she's been into, she almost got her degree in fine arts in weaving, like tapestries and stuff like that, much to her father's dismay. But she ended up in graphic design. And but she's always been interested in yarns and knitting and things like that, tapestries. And she's always told me, alpacas are better than cashmere. And it's like, yeah, who cares? And so, it was, 2 or 3 years ago, my wedding anniversary is coming up. It wasn't the big 25-year anniversary, but it was like, what am I going to do? And at the office where I rent an office now, CNBC was on, and they had one of their reporters talking about how alpacas are the next best thing to invest in, and because of tax incentives and what they're trying to do. And the reporter's standing out in the field with all these alpacas, and I said, "Oh, that's what I'm going to get my wife." So. No. It was one alpaca, and this alpaca ranch happens to be like 20 minutes from where we live, and so I called the ranch owner and found out that you can buy an alpaca, kind of a low quality one for $500, and a super high quality for like $12,000. I bought one more modestly priced, and so I had it arranged with the ranch owner, and I had a photograph. I didn't pick out one, but I had a photograph of one and put it in a card. And my wife kind of nearly fell on the floor when she opened her anniversary card, and it's like, here's your alpaca, and we're going up to the ranch today, and you can pick one out. And so so one turned to 3. 2 of the 3 got pregnant, so that led to 5. And then we had a couple more pregnancies, so now we have 7. And in April we'll have an 8th. And so the point is, it's for the yarn and the fleece. And what she does is we board them at the ranch, so you don't have to. We just write a check. And once a year they have a crew come in and they shear them, and then you send the fleece off to a mill, and the mill comes back into yarn, and then she makes blankets and scarves and sweaters and stuff like that.
That sounds like a great gift.
It is. And it keeps on giving.
Make sure it's true.
On a more serious note, so talking about customer satisfaction, measuring it, survey questions, it feels like asking the right questions is super critical. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you determine, starting from nothing, which questions to ask.
Mm-hmm. It starts with a process. And it starts, I think, with having a defensible process based on the best, let's call it academic standards that are known. We could get a room together of data scientists and market research people, and nobody would agree exactly. So there's a lot of art to it. But what we found is really our approach is, number one, designing, first of all, the survey from the customer's perspective is most critical. If you design it, say, from an engineer's perspective, they're going to leave stuff out, or they're going to talk in very technical terms that don't make sense to the customer. I think that research on research data has shown that if you just ask one question, it doesn't really tell you a lot. So if, a lot of times, oh, we just want to ask you one question, were you satisfied or not? Yes or no? Well, okay, if I say yes and you kind of collect all that data, that's one thing, and how do your competitors fare against that? You don't know. If you say no, and then it kind of leads to, well, then why did you say no? So you can't oversimplify. You've got to marry the concept. So again, looking at it, designing it from the customer's perspective. Number two, you've got to ask it in what I'll call the kind of the most critical. You've got to almost go through the process, whatever that consumer process is. So if you're talking about, I don't know, say airlines, from a consumer's perspective, there's when you book the ticket, when you arrive at the curbside, when you check in, when you go through security, when you board the plane, when you get served on the plane, you kind of almost have to take those as discrete steps, and then you try to figure out, okay, what are the important questions to ask? So we always, J.D. Power and Associates always approached it more from this comprehensive standpoint, and our surveys would be really long, and some people really didn't like that. But it gave you more of an understanding of what the issues were. So instead of just asking the one question about are you satisfied or not, it doesn't help you. I mean, the whole point is it's not just to ask the question, it's to how do I improve? And we always advocate, and I continue to advocate, that we live in a world now of continuous improvement. If you're not, if you're serving customers really well today, tomorrow there could be somebody else there. You've got to be looking at this as a continuous improvement process, not as a static point in time. And so anyhow, I can go on and on if you want about how to ask questions, but I think that's the best way that we approach it, is looking at it from a customer's perspective.
Just as a clarifying point, do you mean doing like kind of qualitative analysis, like a pre-study study on your customers?
Yes, yeah.
Tell me about this airline.
We would do focus groups,
Okay.
Or in-depth interviews.
Okay.
But sometimes you can skip those steps if it's something you're fairly familiar with. If it's something a totally different industry, you'd have to do more of that in-depth qualitative type work, and then testing the instrument. When you start asking the quantitative questions, you got to test it to kind of see. One of the other things is a scale. If you ask people, yes or no is like a really bad scale for kind of measuring relative satisfaction, but just asking, say, highly satisfied, somewhat not satisfied, and definitely not satisfied. That's a 4-point scale. That also doesn't give you much discrimination. You've got to go to, say, something like a 10-point scale to, I'm really getting into the weeds, but there's some science to it, but there's also a lot of art.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It strikes me that some companies actually have built into their business plan the idea that they're not going to satisfy their customers 100%, and that going 100% satisfaction just costs too much money. And I know everybody likes to pick on the telecoms, and we may be unfairly are complaining about these pieces of technology that are mind-blowing and can do things that we just couldn't do. But Verizon hires security guards to be in their stores because they're disappointing a certain number of people every day. And that's baked in. I mean, I think that's baked in. U-Haul is another good example. Like, their plan is to not actually please their customer. Did you? You must have come into contact with some of that, and could you speak to some of those attitudes in the business and how that kind of relates to the banner, to the flag of customer satisfaction?
It's a complex question to answer. I think that if we were focusing, say, on telecom, it is a very complex relationship, between your contracts and the device and the user, and it's incredibly complex, and I can't necessarily even guess. I don't think they literally want to not satisfy their customers, but I think there's also a line where you have to accept you can't satisfy everybody, and I do believe that. At some point you just got to cut your losses and just sort of accept that, hey, so and so's just so unreasonable, we're never going to get them back, and you have to. That's just the world we live in. I'm not as familiar with the U-Haul, whether that's. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I just not as familiar to speak to that. A lot of people would say, General Motors used to be that way, that they didn't care about their customers. That, hey, just the thing breaks, it's the dealers,
Yep.
and they paid for it. Who would have thought that a company that was so important that the federal government was threatening to break them up, that they would end up going bankrupt in 2009. So you do.
Yep.
It does come back to haunt you, and so I guess all I can be is sort of an advocate for customer service and listening to the customer, and I think that's the key that I like to differentiate is the voice of the customer. The voice of the customer really should be part of the lifeblood of any organization. And it's not just customer satisfaction, because voice of the customer, I think, is broader and more encompassing, because especially with technology and things that change, if you're listening to the voice of the customer, and it doesn't mean literally, sometimes customers can't articulate what they want or what's coming, especially in technology. You just have to anticipate, you read the book about Steve Jobs, it's like, I agree, market research can't, it can guide you, but it can't give you the answers.
Yep.
And so, I think, listening to the voice of the customer. And the other thing that I just add is we did analysis of, especially in some of the broader industries, not just the automotive industry. We took different, like the banking industry or the hotel industry, and we were able to correlate the companies that were always in the bottom tier of satisfaction and look at their share price and the change in their shareholder value. And it was remarkable. It was even stronger than we expected, that the companies that did well to their customers were performing better in the stock market than the companies that didn't. And you might always have anomalies, but ultimately I think the world catches up with you.
One of my favorite examples was that when you gave in the book about another industry that's notorious with bad customer service, I think, is plumbers. And so a company grew to be one of the largest regional plumbing services in Southern California by just realizing if they show up on time, if they're well groomed, if they smell nice, and they wear a uniform, their business exploded, because people aren't used to getting that from a plumber. And I've my free business idea, anyone who wants to take me on, contractors, same way. If someone would just show up when they say they're going to show up and do the job the way they're going to do it, that'd be a great business. And I found that there was one here in Seattle called Logan's Hammer that started to take that. Now you just can't get an appointment with them because their business has exploded. But I think it's an opportunity, basically, right? Certain companies view customer satisfaction as an opportunity, particularly if they're an industry that's not known for it.
Yeah.
So I think that wraps us up again. Jamey Power, best-selling author, alpaca farmer. Thank you.